president surrounded by guards, riding in a convoy, suddenly stopping his car. Not for politics, not for power, but to help an old woman carry a heavy sack of grain. This is not fiction. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré. The evening had just begun to fall over Ouagadougou. The city was alive yet peaceful, in that unique way African evenings often are. The horizon glowed in shades of orange, pink, and deep red, as the sun slowly disappeared behind rows of old houses and dusty trees. The streets carried a mix of sounds: vendors calling out their last sales of the day, children laughing and chasing each other barefoot, bicycles rattling along the uneven roads, and the distant hum of motorcycles returning home. Women walked steadily with baskets of vegetables balanced carefully on their heads, while men pushed wooden carts filled with food, firewood, and sacks of grain. The air smelled of roasted corn from roadside stalls, blending with the earthy scent of dust that the evening breeze lifted from the ground. Life in the capital was ordinary, simple and beautiful in its rhythm. Down one of these busy streets, the calm was soon disturbed by a new sound. A low rumble grew louder, echoing between the narrow buildings. People turned their heads and saw a convoy approaching. Sleek black vehicles, headlights shining, and guards sitting tall, their eyes scanning the streets with focus and discipline. Whistles blew as traffic was cleared and pedestrians stepped aside to make way. This was no ordinary convoy. At the center of it, surrounded by soldiers and officials, sat the man who had become a living symbol of resistance and hope for his people, Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. To some, he was the hero of a new chapter in Burkina Faso's history. To others, he was still a mystery, a man who had risen so quickly, from the ranks of a soldier to the position of head of state. For the bystanders, it looked like just another day, just another journey back from an important community meeting. Yet, hidden within this ordinary evening was the beginning of an extraordinary moment. A moment that no convoy, no flashing sirens, and no presidential title could overshadow. A moment where leadership would be redefined not in speeches or grand decisions, but in the simplest act of humanity. And it was about to unfold right there, on that dusty street in Ouagadougou. As the convoy rolled down the crowded street, all eyes followed the line of black cars. Some waved shyly, others just stood in silence, watching history pass before their eyes. For the people of Ouagadougou, it was rare to see the president up close, let alone in their own neighborhood. The soldiers at the front scanned every corner, their hands resting firmly on their weapons, making sure no threat could disturb the journey. But while the guards focused on danger, Ibrahim Traoré's attention wandered elsewhere. From the tinted window of his vehicle, he looked at the faces of ordinary people, the shopkeeper closing his wooden shutters, the barefoot children running with sticks, the elderly sitting quietly on benches, their eyes following the convoy with curiosity. Unlike many leaders who traveled in comfort and looked straight ahead, Traoré had a habit of searching the streets, noticing small details others ignored. And then something caught his eye. Not far from the roadside, an elderly woman was struggling with a large sack of grain. The sack was nearly as big as she was, heavy and unbalanced, pressing against her thin shoulders. Every few steps she paused, her back bending lower, her hands trembling from the weight. She would push forward with effort only to stop again, wiping sweat from her forehead with the edge of her faded scarf. Around her, people glanced but hurried past, each busy with their own burdens. Some pitied her, but no one stepped in to help. In cities, that is often how it is. Everyone notices, but everyone moves on. Inside the convoy, silence filled the car. Traoré leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the struggling woman. The guards hadn't noticed her. To them, she was just another passerby, another face in the crowd. But to Traoré, it was not just a passerby, it was a test. For a moment, he thought of his own childhood in a small Burkina village, where he had seen his own mother carry loads heavier than her strength, where neighbors often helped one another because survival depended on unity. He remembered the lessons of humility, of never thinking oneself too important to serve others. And in that instant, he made a decision that surprised everyone. With a firm voice, he instructed the driver to slow down. The soldiers looked at him in confusion. Stopping the president's convoy in the middle of a busy street was unusual, risky, even dangerous, but Traoré's tone left no room for hesitation. The car pulled over, engines quieted, and the convoy came to a sudden halt. The people nearby froze. Guards stepped out quickly, scanning the surroundings, ready to secure the area. But then came the most shocking sight of all. Ibrahim. Traoré himself opened the car door and stepped onto the dusty street. The murmurs began immediately. What is happening? Why is the president getting out? Some thought perhaps there was a security threat, others whispered in fear. But then they saw where he was walking, straight toward the old woman and her heavy sack of grain. For a few seconds she didn't even recognize him. She was too tired, too focused on balancing her load. When she finally looked up, she gasped, her hands trembling even more, not from the weight, but from shock. Standing before her was not a soldier, not a passerby, but the president of Burkina Faso himself. The street fell into stunned silence. Soldiers stood tense, unsure whether to stop him or let him continue. Drivers leaned out of their cars. Pedestrians froze mid-step, and children stared wide-eyed, holding their mothers' hands tightly. Nobody could believe what they were witnessing. The president, in full view of everyone, walking directly toward an old woman bent beneath the weight of her burden. Ibrahim Traoré's boots pressed softly into the dusty ground as he approached her. His guards moved with him, but he raised his hand subtly, signaling them to stay back. This was not their moment. This was his. The woman struggled again to lift her sack, determined to push forward, her thin arms trembling under the load. She did not expect help. She had lived too long in a world where the poor often carried their burdens alone. But just as she leaned forward to adjust the sack, she heard a calm, steady voice beside her. "Mother," Traoré said gently, "allow me." She lifted her head, squinting at the young man before her. His face was familiar, but her tired eyes did not recognize him at once. She only saw kindness in his expression, a humility rare among men with power. Before she could protest, he had already bent down, gripping the rough sack with firm soldier's hands. Gasps filled the street. People covered their mouths in disbelief. The president, the head of state, commander of the army, the man who stood against global powers, was now lifting the sack of an old woman, carrying it as though it was his own burden. The weight was heavy, but Traoré carried it with steady steps, his back straight, his eyes focused. Years of military training had made his body strong, but this moment was not about strength. It was about dignity, the dignity of a leader who refused to let age and poverty crush one of his own people. The woman followed slowly, tears welling in her eyes. She whispered, "No, my son, you cannot. You are the president." But Traoré only smiled. "Before a president, I am your son. Before I lead, I must serve." Those words struck the crowd like lightning. People pressed closer, some holding their phones to record. Others simply watching in silence, too moved to speak. Shopkeepers left their stalls. Neighbors emerged from their homes, and children ran barefoot behind the small procession. In that single act, Ibrahim Traoré had turned a dusty street into a stage, where history was being written not with speeches but with humility. Step by step he carried the sack until they reached the woman's small home, a modest clay-walled house with a wooden door that leaned slightly from years of use. He gently placed the sack just inside, wiping the dust from his hands. The woman could not hold back her emotions any longer. She placed her trembling hands on his shoulders, blessing him through her tears. "May God protect you, my son. May he give you strength to lead not with pride but with heart." Traoré bowed his head slightly, receiving her prayer with respect. For him, this was no ceremony, no political gesture. It was a reminder that leadership is not measured by the size of one's army or the power of one's speeches, but by the willingness to serve, even in the smallest ways. The guards, the convoy, the entire street remained in awe. Some whispered among themselves, "Never have we seen this before." Others shouted blessings, their voices rising into the evening air. Children clapped and sang his name, not as a distant leader, but as one of their own. When Traoré finally returned to his car, the people did not see him as untouchable. They saw him as a man strong enough to lead a nation, humble enough to carry a burden, and that image would remain in their hearts far longer than any headline or political speech ever could. For a moment, time seemed to stop on that dusty street in Ouagadougou. The crowd that had gathered remained frozen, their eyes locked on the young president who had just done what no one expected. The convoy, usually a symbol of distance between leaders and the people, had suddenly become the bridge that connected them. The whispers started softly, almost uncertain at first. Is this real? Did the president really just carry that sack? Some rubbed their eyes as though they were dreaming. But soon those whispers grew into waves of excitement. Voices rising above the hum of the city. Shopkeepers abandoned their stalls, leaving baskets of fruit and goods unattended, craning their necks to get a better view. Mothers held their children closer, pointing toward Traoré with awe. Young men nudged each other, whispering that they were witnessing something their fathers had never seen: a leader walking among his people not as a ruler but as a servant. One old man, his beard white and his hands rough from years of labor, shook his head slowly and said, "I have lived through presidents who passed us by in black cars, waving through windows. But today I have seen a president bend his back for the weak. This is the kind of leader Africa prayed for." His words spread like fire among the bystanders. Children too young to understand politics understood the language of kindness. They clapped their small hands, chanting his name in unison. "Traoré! Traoré!" Their laughter echoed through the street, turning what began as a quiet evening into a festival of hope. Some even ran barefoot beside the convoy, refusing to let the moment end. For the old woman, it was more than just help, it was dignity restored. She had lived in poverty, often overlooked, often unseen. Yet on that day, the most powerful man in the country had seen her, not as a burden, but as a mother worth serving. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face as she raised her trembling hands toward the sky. Her voice cracked with emotion as she prayed, "O Lord, protect this son of ours. Keep his heart pure, his path straight, and his strength unshaken." Her prayer was not hers alone. The people around her echoed Amin, Amin in unison, their voices weaving together into a chorus that filled the street. It was no longer just about the sack of grain. It was about what the act represented: a leader lowering himself to lift others up. The guards, hardened men who rarely allowed emotions to show, exchanged glances. They were trained to shield the president, to protect him at all costs. Yet here they were, witnessing him protect something greater: his humanity. Some of them stood with pride swelling silently in their chests, realizing that this man was not simply their commander but their example. Word of the event traveled fast. Within hours, the story moved beyond that neighborhood, carried by those who had witnessed it. Videos recorded on shaky phones spread like wildfire across markets, villages, and towns. People gathered around screens in tea shops, watching the moment again and again, their hearts swelling with pride. For many, it was the first time they felt that their leader was not a distant figure sitting in a palace, but a man walking their very streets. Across Burkina Faso, conversations changed. Some said, "If he can stop for one woman, maybe he will stop for all of us." Others declared, "This is a new kind of leadership, one that listens, one that serves, one that lives among us, not above us." Even critics, who often doubted young leaders, found themselves silenced by the image of humility. It is hard to argue against a leader who proves his character not in front of cameras, but in the quiet corners of everyday life. And so the reactions of that single evening rippled outward like waves in water. What began as a simple act of kindness became a symbol of something larger: the rebirth of trust, the renewal of hope, and the reminder that true power is not measured by how many follow you, but by how many you are willing to serve. The people of Ouagadougou would never forget that day. They would tell it to their children, and their children's children, as a story not of politics but of humanity, a story where leadership was defined not by titles or speeches, but by the willingness to carry the burdens of others. The story of that evening did not stay on the streets of Ouagadougou for long. Like fire carried by the wind, it spread far beyond the neighborhood, far beyond the capital, and eventually far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. That night, as families gathered in their homes for dinner, neighbors told one another what they had seen. Some had witnessed it with their own eyes. Others had heard it from a friend of a friend. But every version carried the same essence. The president had stopped his convoy, stepped into the dust, and carried the burden of a poor, struggling mother. In a country where many leaders had once lived above the people, this simple act became a living symbol of a new kind of leadership. By morning, phone videos taken on shaky hands were being shared in markets, bus stops, and tea stalls. Men leaned forward to replay the moment. Women shook their heads in amazement, and young people passed the clips from one device to another as though they had found something too valuable to keep for themselves. In the villages where internet signals were weak, the story traveled by word of mouth. Farmers told it while resting under mango trees, and elders repeated it in the evening gatherings, their voices filled with pride. Soon the story crossed borders. Across West Africa, newspapers picked it up. Headlines called him the people's president, the humble leader of Burkina Faso, and a servant before a ruler. On radio stations in Mali, Niger, Ghana, and even Senegal, callers debated what this meant. Some said, "This is how all African leaders should behave." Others whispered, "Maybe Africa is entering a new chapter, one where leaders are not untouchable kings, but brothers among us." Beyond Africa, the ripples reached global audiences. International journalists who once only spoke of Burkina Faso in terms of poverty, coups and struggles, suddenly had a different story to tell, a story of humility and leadership. For once the world was not looking at Burkina Faso with pity, but with admiration. But the ripple effect was not only in headlines, it was in hearts. Across Burkina Faso, people felt a shift in their relationship with power. For years, many had believed that leaders lived far above them, unreachable and distant. But here was proof that a leader could kneel, could carry, could serve. That knowledge alone changed the way people saw themselves and their future. In schools, teachers told the story to children, reminding them that greatness is not about wealth or titles, but about serving others. In mosques and churches, religious leaders used the example in sermons, telling their followers that even those with the highest authority are never too important to show kindness. Even within the military, the story became legend. Soldiers, who often measured strength in weapons and discipline, now measured it also in humility. They spoke of their commander not only as a strategist or fighter, but as a man whose strength came from his ability to remain human in the face of power. The ripple effect reached the youth most powerfully. Young men and women, often told that leadership is for the rich, the powerful, or the old, saw in Traoré an example of something different. They began to believe that leadership was not about privilege, but about a responsibility. Not about how high you rise, but about how far you are willing to bend for others. In their hearts, a fire of hope was lit, a belief that perhaps their generation could lead differently. Meanwhile, those who once criticized him, who doubted his age or questioned his decisions, found themselves confronted with an undeniable truth. They could argue with policies, they could debate strategies, but they could not erase the image of him carrying that sack. It was too raw, too real, too deeply human to dismiss. And as the days passed, that single act of kindness became more than a story, it became a symbol. It reminded the people of Burkina Faso that their president was not a man hiding behind palace walls, but someone willing to walk among them, share their burdens, and lift their weight when they faltered. Months later, when challenges arose, people would recall that day. They would say, "Yes, times are hard. Yes, the road is difficult. But remember the day he carried the sack? If he carried her burden, then surely he carries ours too." That faith, born from a simple act, gave the people strength in moments of doubt. And so what began as a quiet decision on a dusty street grew into a movement of belief. Belief in humility, belief in leadership with humanity, belief that even in the highest seats of power, there is room for compassion. This was the ripple effect of Ibrahim Traoré's choice. It was not just the sack of an old woman he carried that day. It was the weight of a nation's hope. And by lifting it, he had shown Africa and the world that true leadership is not about being served, but about serving others. As the dust of that unforgettable evening settled, one truth remained clear. Leadership had been redefined before the eyes of an entire nation. What happened on that street in Ouagadougou was not about politics nor about power. It was about humanity. Too often people believe that leaders must be distant, untouchable, wrapped in luxury and guarded by walls. For generations, many African nations had seen leaders who separated themselves from the very people they were meant to serve. They were men of speeches, parades, and promises, but rarely of action when it came to the struggles of ordinary lives. But Ibrahim Traoré's small act of kindness shattered that image. In bending down to carry a burden, he lifted something much greater, the spirit of his people. He reminded them that the heart of leadership is not in titles, but in service, not in commanding from above, but in walking beside those you lead. The moral was clear. Greatness is not measured by how high one rises, but by how low one is willing to bend for others. A leader's true power is not in the number of guards who protect him, nor in the size of the convoy that follows him. It is in the willingness to stop, to notice, and to act with compassion when no one expects it. For the old woman, the sack of grain was heavy, but for the nation, the weight was symbolic. Every citizen carries a burden: poverty, hardship, struggle, pain. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré showed that a leader's duty is not only to speak about those burdens, but to share them, even if just for a few steps on a dusty road. The story teaches us all something deeper, beyond politics, beyond nations. It teaches that kindness is timeless, that humility is the highest form of strength, and that no matter how powerful we become, we are never too great to serve others. Parents began telling the story to their children at bedtime, not as a tale of a president, but as a lesson of humanity. When you see someone struggle, do not walk away. Lend your hand, carry their weight, because in helping them, you also lift yourself. Teachers repeated it in classrooms, saying, "Remember, true leaders are servants first." Elders in villages shared it under the night sky, reminding the youth, this is what Africa needs, not rulers, but sons and daughters who serve. And perhaps the most powerful moral of all was this: one small act can move millions. One decision made in seconds can echo across years. A convoy stopping, a sack being lifted, a woman's prayer. These may seem small in the moment, but they can shape the destiny of nations. For the people of Burkina Faso, that dusty street became a symbol carved into memory. For the wider world, it became proof that leadership does not always wear a crown, stand on a stage, or sit in a palace. Sometimes leadership wears dust on its shoes, sweat on its brow, and kindness in its heart. And so the story ends not with applause, not with celebration, but with a simple reminder to all who listen. If a president can stop to carry a burden, then surely we too can stop to carry the burdens of those around us. That is not just leadership, it is humanity. And humanity is the greatest power of all. If this story moved you, then share it with others, because the world needs more reminders of true leadership. And if you believe kindness is the real strength, then don't just watch, spread the message. Subscribe for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us that together, we can change the world.